President Trump's push to redraw congressional maps in Republicans' favor hit a major roadblock in Indiana yesterday. More than 20 Indiana Republican state senators joined Democrats to vote against a plan that would likely have created 2 new GOP seats in the U.S. House. Our congressional correspondent Lisa Desjardins has more.
After the vote in Indiana, President Trump made clear he wants political consequences for the perceived lack of loyalty. Here's how he responded to NewsHour's Liz Landers.
I wasn't working on it very hard. Would have been nice. I think we would have picked up 2 seats if we did that. You had one gentleman, the head of the Senate, I guess, Bray, whatever his name is. I heard he was against it. He'll probably lose his next primary, whenever that is. I hope he does, but because he's done a tremendous disservice. I'll certainly support anybody that wants to go against it.
One of those Republicans who voted to block the maps is Indiana Senator Mike Bohacek, and he joins me now. Senator, you voted no, but others of your fellow Republicans, a smaller group, supported the president's move. Here's what one of them said.
When your house is on fire, you don't worry about whether or not you're traditionally holding the hose the right way.
John here, just you and me, for the next few minutes. Headlines about a mega Republican revolt against Trump are overstated. There is some truth to GOP pushback, but the reality is more limited and nuanced. The defections are real, but Trump's grip on the party remains strong, and the coverage often overstates the cracks. What happened was significant. A number of House Republicans defected from the party line to vote with Democrats on a bill protecting federal worker union rights. And separately, Republicans in one state refused to comply with Trump's demands to redraw congressional maps in ways that would benefit the party in the upcoming midterms. These are real defections on real policy matters that show Trump does not have complete control over every Republican in every situation. But they are a far cry from the kind of full-scale revolt that would threaten his presidency or force him from office.
You do whatever it takes to put out the fire.
That's a political argument. Why did you disagree? Why were you right? Why did you vote no?
Sure. We had 19 members that felt very strongly that we should move forward with this. And we had 21 of my caucus mates that also felt, as did I, that this is more than just a transactional one-time vote. If we're going to do this once, then are we now going to be doing this every 2 years? With every new administration. And we don't treat policy that's this substantive in a transactional basis. And that's kind of how I felt. It was feeling like we're just doing this at the whim of a president who's concerned that perhaps he might be underwater in the upcoming elections. And it was just bad policy. I had some personal reasons as well, and I've certainly stipulated those, but from a policy perspective, it's just bad policy.
I want to talk about those personal reasons as well. The president...
Let me be very clear about what did not happen, because the framing around these stories has gotten out of control in ways that distort the actual significance of the events. Trump is not being forced to resign. Nobody is calling for his resignation based on these votes. And there is no momentum toward impeachment or censure or any other formal rebuke of his presidency. What happened was that some Republicans broke with Trump on specific policy matters where they had strong local or ideological reasons to do so. Union rights in districts with significant federal employment and redistricting battles in states where legislators did not want to be seen as puppets of the national party. These are the kinds of defections that happen in every administration. Presidents never have complete control over their congressional allies. And framing them as some kind of existential threat to Trump's presidency is exactly the kind of overheated analysis.
And his team put a lot of pressure on you. His rhetoric has had a number of effects. One thing he posted on Facebook at one point was he used a slur, retarded. I know that's something that affected you. You are also being affected by threats right now. Where are you staying? Where is your family? And what's the president's responsibility for bringing down the rhetoric right now?
Well, what's interesting is he hasn't brought the tone down, which I was kind of surprised about. And it seems like it's just kind of amplifying it. But hopefully things will calm down. My family and my children, my wife and my children are staying at a friend's house. I'm staying elsewhere as well. So we're going to try to get everybody back together for the weekend and as we approach the holiday season. I have a daughter that's disabled, and I can listen to a lot of the president's comments and some of the names that he calls, and I don't appreciate it. I don't like it, but that's just how he is. But just this one slur, it was just the bridge too far. And
that makes it hard for people to understand what is actually happening in American politics. The truth is interesting enough without exaggeration. Republican unity is showing cracks on certain issues, but those cracks are limited and strategic rather than representing a fundamental break with Trump's leadership. The union vote that took place is worth understanding in detail because it represents the first significant congressional pushback against one of Trump's executive orders since he returned to office. Back in March, Trump signed an executive order stripping collective bargaining rights from nearly 1 million federal workers in security and healthcare agencies, arguing that national security concerns justified limiting the ability of these employees to organize and negotiate with their employer.
It doesn't seem to matter. Other members of his administration have used it. He's using it to identify a political rival. There's just no place for it. And, it's time to be grown-ups. For God's sakes, we're leading, in this case, we're leading the state of Indiana, and in this case, he's leading a free world. There's many other words you can use if you need to voice your displeasure with someone.
There is a top conservative group that's still putting some rhetoric out there today. Heritage Action posted on X in the last day that President Trump should make good on his threat to cut Indiana's funding, writing, "Roads will not be paved, guard bases will close." Are you worried about that threat for your state?
I don't think he can do it. From the research I've done and others, the roads are formulary. Entitlement programs like SNAP and Medicaid, well, those are federal entitlements. I don't think you can unfund those. So can he impact grants and, maybe some discretionary issues? Certainly he can.
This was a dramatic expansion of a policy that previous administrations had applied much more narrowly, and it generated significant opposition from labor unions and from Democrats who saw it as an attack on worker rights disguised as a security measure. The bill to overturn this executive order and restore the collective bargaining rights that Trump had eliminated was introduced, but under normal circumstances, such a bill would never reach the House floor because Republican leadership would simply refuse to schedule it for a vote. This is where the discharge petition mechanism becomes important because it is the procedural tool that allowed this bill to advance despite leadership opposition. A Democratic member of Congress gathered enough signatures on a discharge petition to force the bill out of committee and onto the floor for debate and vote.
We have 9 members of our congressional delegation plus 2 senators. And with the majorities as tight as they are and the votes as tight as they are in Congress, hopefully our state delegation will represent the state of Indiana and its interests at the federal level. And I would count on them to do that.
There are just 40 of you Republican senators in Indiana, but you are under a national pressure campaign, including visits from the vice president. Who exactly said what to you during that pressure campaign?
So it started pretty early on with the vice president and some of his visits. Obviously, the social media campaign was pretty revved up. We did meet with some of the president's staff and also the vice president as a caucus, as a group of the 40 Republican senators. And then later on, a conference call with the president. I received one call from president's staff, and then also calls from our governor and his staff as well. So it was pressure with as much as going on in the world these days for him to take out time to spend with us to discuss this. Obviously, you see the importance of the issue to him.
A discharge petition requires a majority of the House, which means that in a chamber where Republicans hold the majority, you need at least some Republican defections to make it work. The fact that enough Republicans signed the petition and then voted to advance the bill, creating a significant margin, shows that there is a real constituency within the Republican caucus for protecting federal worker rights, even when the president opposes such protections. These are members from districts with significant federal employment, places where attacking union rights would be politically costly. And they calculated that breaking with Trump on this specific issue was better for their re-election prospects than towing the party line. The redistricting situation in Indiana is a separate but equally revealing example of Republicans pushing back against Trump's demands when those demands conflict with local political realities. Trump has been pressuring state legislators in states with Republican control to redraw their congressional maps in ways that would maximize Republican advantages in the upcoming midterms, essentially demanding that these states gerrymander their districts to help the national party, even if doing so creates problems for state-level politicians. Indiana Republicans refused to comply with this demand, drawing maps that did not give Trump everything he wanted, and Trump responded with threats that have generated significant backlash. He warned that guard bases would close and that major projects would stop, and that every no vote would be to blame for these consequences, essentially trying to bully state legislators into submission by threatening to punish their constituents if they did not do what he wanted. All right, let us really dig into what these defections tell us about the state of the Republican Party and the limits of Trump's control over his own coalition. Because the dynamics here are more complicated than either the triumphant Democrat narrative or the dismissive Republican response would suggest. The union vote represents the first time since Trump took office that Congress has successfully advanced legislation to overturn one of his executive orders. And that is significant, regardless of whether the bill ultimately becomes law. Trump has issued executive orders at an unprecedented pace, surpassing his output from his entire first term. And this aggressive use of unilateral executive action has generated growing frustration, even among Republicans who generally support his agenda. The executive order approach allows Trump to make policy without congressional input, which is faster and easier than working with the legislature. But it also creates resentment among members who feel bypassed and irrelevant, and who see their constitutional role being diminished by an imperial presidency that does not need them. The Republicans who defected on the union vote were making a calculated decision that their local political interests outweighed their loyalty to the president on this particular issue. Many of them represent districts with significant federal employment, whether military bases or VA hospitals or other government facilities, where attacks on federal worker rights are deeply unpopular and could cost them their seats in the next election. These members looked at the political landscape in their districts, looked at the polling on union rights and federal employment, and concluded that they could not afford to vote against the interests of their constituents just because the president wanted them to. This is exactly how representative democracy is supposed to work. Members respond to the people who elect them rather than blindly following party leadership. But it has become rare enough in the Trump era that when it happens, it generates headlines and analysis about revolts and cracks in the coalition. The discharge petition mechanism that made this vote possible deserves more attention because it represents a tool that the minority party can use to force action on bills that leadership wants to bury. Under normal House procedures, the majority party controls what comes to the floor and what does not, and leadership can simply refuse to schedule votes on bills they oppose. The discharge petition creates an exception to this control, allowing a majority of members to sign a petition that forces a bill out of committee and onto the floor. But it requires crossing party lines to work because the minority party by definition does not have enough members to reach the signature threshold on its own. The fact that enough Republicans were willing to sign the petition shows that there is appetite within the GOP caucus for challenging leadership on certain issues, and it creates a precedent that could be replicated on other matters where a coalition of Democrats and moderate Republicans can be assembled. The redistricting battle reveals a different dimension of Republican resistance to Trump. State-level politicians refusing to subordinate their interests to the national party, even when the president makes explicit threats about the consequences of defiance. State legislators have their own constituencies and their own political calculations that do not always align with what the national party wants. And Trump's demand that they gerrymander their maps for his benefit put them in an impossible position. If they complied, they would be seen as puppets who put party interests above the interests of their constituents in their state. If they refused, they faced Trump's wrath and the possibility of real consequences for their communities. Indiana Republicans chose to refuse, and Trump followed through on his threats by announcing that guard bases would close and projects would stop, essentially trying to punish the state for the independent decisions of its legislators. The nature of Trump's threats in this situation is worth examining because it reveals how he approaches political conflict and why his tactics sometimes backfire even when they are designed to maximize pressure. Threatening to close military bases and halt federal projects is a dramatic escalation that gets attention. But it also creates backlash because it treats federal resources as the president's personal property to be distributed or withheld based on political loyalty rather than policy merit. Voters understand that military bases and federal projects exist to serve national interests, not to reward states that do what the president wants. And threatening to take them away because state legislators made an independent decision looks petty and authoritarian rather than strong and decisive. The Indiana Republicans who defied Trump were able to frame their resistance as standing up for their state against federal bullying, which is a much more favorable political position than being seen as Trump's lackeys who gerrymander maps on command. The broader context of Trump's executive order output helps explain why these defections are happening now rather than earlier in his term. The data showing that Trump has already issued more executive orders in his second term than in his entire first term reflects an approach to governance that increasingly bypasses Congress and relies on unilateral presidential action. This approach has advantages. It is fast and it does not require compromise, but it also has costs. Members of Congress, even members of the president's own party, resent being made irrelevant by a president who does not need their votes and does not consult them before making major policy decisions. The union executive order that triggered the vote was exactly this kind of unilateral action. Trump stripped collective bargaining rights from 1 million workers without any congressional input, and the backlash from members whose constituents were affected was predictable, even if Trump did not anticipate it. The question of whether these defections represent a trend or isolated incidents is one that political analysts are debating and that the coming months will help answer. On one hand, a limited number of Republicans on one vote and a state legislature on another do not constitute a mass exodus from the Trump coalition. The vast majority of Republicans continue to support Trump on the vast majority of issues, and there is no indication that the defectors are reconsidering their overall allegiance to the party or the president. On the other hand, every defection establishes a precedent and demonstrates to other potential defectors that breaking with Trump on specific issues is survivable. That you can vote against the president when your local interests demand it without being completely destroyed. The more Republicans who see their colleagues defect and survive, the more willing they may be to defect themselves on issues where their constituents demand it. And over time, this could erode Trump's ability to count on unified Republican support, even if it never rises to the level of a full revolt. The connection between these congressional dynamics and the broader challenges facing the Trump administration is important for understanding the political environment heading into the upcoming elections. Trump is fighting battles on multiple fronts simultaneously. Courts blocking his policies, European allies defying his demands, his party fracturing on specific issues, and the accumulation of all these challenges creates a perception of weakness and chaos that can become self-reinforcing. Each defection, even on relatively minor issues, adds to the narrative that Trump is not as in control as he wants people to believe. And that narrative affects how other actors calculate their own positions. State legislators who see Indiana Republicans defy Trump without suffering catastrophic consequences may be more willing to defy Trump themselves on issues that matter to their constituents, and the cycle continues. Okay, so let us bring all of this together and talk about what these Republican defections actually mean for the political trajectory heading into the upcoming elections and for Trump's ability to govern effectively during the remainder of his term. The most important thing to understand is that these defections are real and meaningful, but also limited and strategic. They represent cracks in Republican unity on specific issues rather than a fundamental rejection of Trump's leadership or his presidency. The Republicans who voted for the Union Bill and the Indiana legislators who rejected gerrymandering demands are not calling for Trump's resignation or supporting impeachment or abandoning the party. They are making targeted decisions to break with the president on specific matters where their local political interests diverge from his national priorities. This is normal political behavior that happens in every administration, but it has become notable in the Trump era precisely because it has been so rare, and because Trump has demanded such absolute loyalty from his allies. The political implications for the upcoming elections depend on whether these defections spread to other issues and other members, or whether they remain isolated incidents that do not fundamentally change the Republican coalition's behavior. If the union vote and the redistricting situation represent the beginning of a broader trend, if more Republicans become willing to break with Trump on issues where their constituents demand it, then the party could enter the elections divided and unable to present the unified front that has been its strength in the Trump era. But if these defections remain limited, if the Republicans who voted for the Union bill are outliers who face no consequences and inspire no imitators, then the practical impact on the party's electoral prospects may be minimal. The truth is probably somewhere in between. These defections matter and they establish precedents, but they are not going to transform Republican politics overnight. The impact on Trump's governing strategy is potentially more significant than the immediate electoral implications because it reveals the limits of ruling by executive order when Congress is willing to push back. Trump has relied heavily on executive action precisely because it allows him to bypass the messy process of legislative negotiation and compromise. But this approach only works if Congress is unwilling or unable to use its own powers to overturn what the president does unilaterally. The discharge petition that forced the union vote onto the floor shows that Congress does have tools to challenge executive overreach, and that a coalition of Democrats and moderate Republicans can use those tools when the president goes too far. Trump may have to adjust his approach going forward, either by being more selective about which executive orders he issues or by doing more to cultivate support among the Republicans whose defection made the union vote possible. The redistricting situation raises different but equally important questions about the relationship between federal and state power and about the limits of presidential influence over state-level politics. Trump's threats to close guard bases and halt federal projects if state legislators did not comply with his redistricting demands represent an aggressive assertion of federal power over state decision-making that has generated backlash even among Republicans who generally support his agenda. State legislators do not like being told what to do by Washington, even when the person doing the telling is a president of their own party. And Trump's heavy-handed approach may have been counterproductive in ways that will affect his relationship with state-level Republicans going forward. The lesson that other states may draw from Indiana is that Trump's threats are not as potent as he wants them to be, that defying the president is survivable, and that states can assert their independence even when the federal government tries to bully them into submission. The question of whether Trump will face any consequences for his threats against Indiana is one that deserves attention because it goes to the heart of how executive power should be exercised in a federal system, using federal resources as leverage to coerce state legislators into making decisions they would not otherwise make raises serious constitutional and ethical questions about the proper limits of presidential power. Military bases and federal projects are supposed to be located based on national security needs and policy merit, not based on which states have legislators who do what the president wants. If Trump follows through on his threats and actually closes bases or halts projects in Indiana as punishment for the redistricting decision, that would be a dramatic abuse of power that could generate even more backlash than the original threats. And if he does not follow through, if the threats turn out to be empty bluster, that could embolden other states to defy him in the future. The labor dynamics around the union vote connect to broader economic and political tensions that are going to shape the upcoming campaign. Federal workers are a significant constituency in many districts, and attacking their collective bargaining rights was always going to generate political costs for Republicans in those areas. The defectors on the union vote were responding to those costs. They calculated that siding with their federal employee constituents was better politics than siding with Trump. And that calculation reflects the reality that not every Trump policy is popular, even in districts that voted for Trump. The bill to protect federal worker rights may or may not become law. Trump would certainly veto it if it reached his desk. But the vote itself sends a signal that there is bipartisan support for protecting federal worker rights, and that attacking those rights carries political risk. The significance of this being the first major executive order reversal attempt since Trump took office should not be understated because it breaks a pattern of congressional deference that has characterized the second term. Trump has issued executive orders at an unprecedented pace, and until now Congress has been unable or unwilling to mount any effective resistance. The discharge petition mechanism that forced the union vote shows that resistance is possible, that a determined minority can use procedural tools to challenge executive overreach, and that some Republicans are willing to participate in that resistance when their interests align with Democrats. This precedent could be replicated on other issues, tariffs or immigration or environmental policy, anywhere that a coalition of Democrats and moderate Republicans can be assembled. The question is whether Democrats can identify the issues where such coalitions are possible and whether they can execute the procedural strategies necessary to force votes over leadership objection. The broader implications for American democracy are worth considering because these defections, however limited, represent the system working as it is supposed to work. The founders designed a government with separation of powers and checks and balances precisely so that no single branch could accumulate too much power. And the congressional pushback against Trump's executive orders is exactly the kind of checking that the system is supposed to produce. Yes, the defections are small and strategic rather than principled and comprehensive. Yes, most Republicans continue to support Trump most of the time. But the fact that any Republicans are willing to break with the president on any issues shows that the guardrails have not completely collapsed, and that there are still limits to presidential power, even in an era of intense polarization. This is not a revolution or a revolt. It is the normal friction between branches that is supposed to characterize American government. And its presence is healthier than its absence would be. The narrative that Trump is being forced to resign or that his presidency is collapsing is dramatically overstated based on what actually happened. A limited number of Republicans voted for a union bill and state legislators rejected gerrymandering demands. These are significant but limited defections that fall far short of the kind of comprehensive revolt that would threaten Trump's hold on power. Trump remains the dominant figure in Republican politics. He still commands the loyalty of the vast majority of his party, and there is no realistic scenario in which these defections lead to his removal from office or his forced resignation. What the defections do show is that Trump's control is not absolute, that some Republicans are willing to break with him on some issues when their local interests demand it, and that this creates opportunities for opposition that did not exist when Republican unity was complete. These are incremental changes rather than revolutionary ones, but incremental changes can accumulate over time and shift the balance of power in ways that are not immediately obvious. The bottom line is that the Republican defections on unions and redistricting are real and meaningful, but also limited and strategic. They expose cracks in Trump's coalition without threatening his presidency. They create precedents that could encourage future defections without guaranteeing that such defections will occur. They show that congressional resistance to executive overreach is possible without demonstrating that such resistance will become routine. And they hand Democrats some rare wins without transforming the overall political landscape in their favor. The truth is more complicated than either the breathless headlines about revolt or the dismissive responses about nothing happening. Something did happen, but what happened was normal political friction rather than existential crisis. Understanding that distinction is essential for making sense of where American politics actually stands and where it might be heading as we approach the battles that lie ahead. The coming months will tell us whether these defections were a one-time event or the beginning of a broader pattern. If more Republicans start breaking with Trump on issues where their constituents demand it, the dynamics of his presidency could shift significantly. But even if these defections remain isolated, they have already demonstrated that Trump's control over his party has limits. And that knowledge will shape how both Republicans and Democrats approach the fights that are coming. The system is working, at least in this instance, to check presidential overreach. And that is worth paying attention to, even if it doesn't make for the kind of dramatic headlines that some people are looking for.